And before I jump in, I just want to say thank you for your guys' patience. I'm a little late getting this posted. I did get it finished last night before midnight and then accidentally erased everything. So instead of trying to groggily kind of walk you guys through the presentation again, I decided to wait till the morning. So again, thank you for being patient. And another thing I kind of wanted to say before we get started is that this chapter was absolutely packed. It was full of important information, examples, and specifics about ethics and macro social work. Honestly, it was kind of a lot to digest all at once, and I struggled a little bit with what to include and what to leave out. So in the end, I decided to focus on the bigger areas, the general principles and themes, rather than trying to cover every single detail. But that being said, I'll definitely be bookmarking this chapter and coming back to it as I deal with different situations and ethical questions during my social work practice. So I invite you to think of today as a foundation, something that you're going to keep building on instead of like the ultimate resource on ethical practice. Okay, just one more thing before we dive in. I want to make clear that ethics and values aren't just about following rigid rules. They're more about how we show up for others when the path starts to get really messy. Ethics and values are both the compass and the roadmap and rules that are going to help us stay grounded when our choices aren't so clear. And as I built this presentation, I want you to know I pulled not just from chapter 12, but also from articles by Reamer, Adipo, and Furman to kind of help us wrap around our minds around the real world complexities that show up when you're working with systems, organizations, and communities. So let's kick off by comparing direct, or micro maybe, practice with macro practice. Because I work so regularly in direct practice with individuals or maybe just a child and a parent, I thought this comparison would be a good way to help set the frame for us today and keep our minds a little more anchored in what it is we're talking about. So in direct practice, you're usually focused on one client, hopefully one situation at a time. There's clearer boundaries. If you're lucky, you get to see some really cool immediate impacts, and you get to have those really nice targeted, focused interventions. Macro practice? Well, that's kind of like taking a close-up headshot of that individual and then zooming way out to include, family and community and then entire systems. So, of course, when you're zooming out and including all those different people and organizations and stakeholders, things get a lot messier. The power dynamics shift, interests compete, politics can even sneak into what seems like a basic decision. And when it comes to ethics, the complexity ramps up really, really fast. You're managing multiple diverse constituencies, ripple effects, unintended consequences, and resource struggles. So everything isn't just bigger, it's blurrier too. There will be no perfect solutions. In macro practice, ethical dilemmas rarely hand you a one single right answer. You're often going to be choosing between two good things and having to manage the trade-offs. So when I say two good things, I mean things like transparency and confidentiality, loyalty to your organization versus loyalty to your client. These are all good things, and sometimes they're going to compete against each other. So it's very rarely going to be this really good thing versus this really bad thing. That's just not how it works. And navigating well through these issues means having to think more strategically about stakeholder impacts, long-term consequences, and not just quick wins and getting the issue off your plate. And as we dig deeper into these ideas, I did think it was really important to kind of clarify the distinction between values and ethics, right? So, values are like our compass. They're our internal compass. They're what you believe is good, right, desirable. So you can kind of think of them as your own personal values. Or for social work, the NASW has even pointed out some core values for us, like service and social justice and dignity. Now, on the other hand, ethics are more like the professional rules of the road or the road map for action. They're going to tell you how to act responsibly, not just how to feel. Our values kind of tell us how to feel, and we can compare our actions by our values, but at the end of the day, ethics are going to be those actions that we absolutely have to take, even when they're hard. And luckily for us, we have these professional standards, guidelines, and decision-making frameworks that can help us do that. Because at the end of the day, in practice, we need more than good intentions. We need clear reasoning, consistent standards, and accountability to something bigger than ourselves. Our professional ethics, they're going to supply that. So in short, think of it this way. Your values are the place you're trying to reach. They're the destination. Your ethics are the road rules that keep you and others safe along the way. Values tell you where you're going. Ethics tell you how to drive. Both matter, but they aren't the same. Ethics. Let's get into what the NASW Code of Ethics lays out for us. The 6 major areas of responsibility. As social workers, it's important to remember that we're not just responsible to our clients. We also have ethical responsibilities to our colleagues, our practice settings, ourselves as professionals, the broader profession as a whole, and to society. And that matters because in macro practice, these responsibilities can sometimes pull us in different directions and create tension. So, for example, doing what's best for an individual client can sometimes conflict with an agency policy or even broader societal goals. So, let's take a look at each of these kind of individually. For clients, we prioritize dignity, self-determination, and confidentiality. However, we also have to recognize that there are limits to those priorities, especially when safety is at risk. So there's an ethical balance we have to strike between client autonomy while also taking necessary steps to prevent serious and imminent harm. For colleagues and practice settings, we need to focus on respect, honest collaboration, and pushing for ethical organizational policies, even when that can be a little uncomfortable. For the profession, we have a duty to contribute to the social work knowledge base and strengthen the profession through education. We have to remember that what we do as social workers are going to help shape the future of social work. And finally, for society, we have a duty to advocate, to challenge injustice while promoting social justice, and to help shape systems that are fairer for everyone. And our path to doing this is engaging in political action and advocating. So at this point, I think it's helpful to pause and reflect. When have you felt pulled between following a rule and doing what felt right? I experienced this in my teaching career when the so-called policy, I never saw it, but the so-called policy said that we were not allowed to call children by preferred names without parental permission, essentially forcing kids to out themselves to their parents before they're ready. I chose to do what I felt was right and not follow this rule. But there was a lot of tension there and a lot of fear for me about what was going to happen to me in my job by choosing the principle over the policy in that situation. And this tension between policies and principles, that's really what's at the heart of ethical dilemmas. That's where they begin, and that's where our critical thinking really becomes essential. Talk about what ethical dilemmas actually look like in real life. So, real world ethical dilemmas aren't usually a battle between good and evil. They're much more complicated, and usually they put you in a place where you might be choosing between two important values. For example, should you exclude undocumented clients from services just because a funding source says so? Or perhaps you are put into a position where you might have to accept money from a donor that's tied to an unethical organization or someone who has problematic practices of their own. You also could be put in a position where your organization wants you to prioritize easy cases just to boost your success rates and give you really great metrics for things like grants. And then finally, agencies overall tend to face a lot of funding pressures that might quietly push you to compromise on some values or even not that seriously make you do things that you know aren't in the best interest of your clients or your constituents. One of the things I remember from when I was teaching was we received grant money at my charter school, but it required the kids to get up and move every 15 minutes. And at this particular school with the particular behaviors that we saw there, that was chaotic and almost impossible to make happen. But we needed the money. So these aren't simple decisions. They require us to really think deeply about our values, the impact on all kinds of stakeholders, and what the long-term consequences of the decision might look like. And that's why ethics can't be something we handle on autopilot. Because it's not just good versus evil. That would be very black and white and very clean cut. Instead, it tends to be more so good versus good. It might be trying to weigh loyalty to the client versus loyalty to the organization, or confidentiality versus safety, or transparency versus confidentiality. These are all good things, but sometimes you're put into a position where you have to choose one and prioritize one over the other. Thankfully, the NASW Code of Ethics gives us a little information about how to handle this. It says, when conflicts arise among competing ethical standards or between ethical and legal standards, social workers should seek to resolve the conflict in a responsible manner that minimizes harm to all parties. So again, ethics has to be something that we handle in a slow, deliberate way. One reason is pressure and anxiety can really cloud our ability to reason. So if we're trying to make a decision in a moment in which we're reacting, we could bypass a lot of our core values unintentionally. And another reason why it has to be deliberate is that structure is going to help protect our own integrity. Frameworks will guide us through complexity, and having processes in place will keep us from making impulsive choices and make sure that we are protecting our integrity. So, if you don't want mistakes to happen and you don't want to make too quick of decisions, what can you do? So Reamer offers 4 tools that we can use to kind of slow down and make us make better decisions. So one might be quick curbside consults with colleagues. This is the one I probably see myself doing the most. And these can just be some informal peer discussions that can help you create clarity around your issue. And then there's formal ethics consults that might have more of a method I can't say methodological framework to help you take those complex cases and really sort through them in a meaningful, structured way. And then there's agency ethics committees that can kind of specialize and be a group that you go to figure out these issues and help establish standards for your organization. And then finally, ethics rounds, which are just ongoing case conversations. And the more you talk to others about the ethical dilemmas they're facing and about your own, you're going to be strengthening those ethical reflexes. And it'll become something that's more natural to you because you're talking about it outside of that heated, ignited moment. So the key idea is we don't have to, and we really should not navigate ethical dilemmas alone. So working with colleagues and working with others can help us check our own blind spots and uncover some personal biases that maybe you didn't even realize you had. But even more importantly to me, I think, is that when you're talking to others about these ethical dilemmas and including others in solving these issues, ethics aren't just a burden on you anymore. It's a burden among everybody. The weight of your decisions are now going to be distributed among multiple people, so you don't have to be in it alone. I really like this quote. It said, "When we face tough decisions alone, we see through a keyhole. When we face them together, we see the whole room." Collaborating with others makes our thinking stronger and helps protect everyone involved. The tension that we face as social workers is balancing self-determination and risk. I think this is probably the one that comes up for most of us, no matter what kind of work you're doing under the umbrella of social work. I think everybody runs into this at some point. And essentially, clients have the right to make their own choices, even when those choices carry risk. But when there's a credible threat of serious harm, we have an ethical duty to step in. And finding that middle ground between honoring autonomy and protecting safety is some of the most important work we do, but it can be really hard when we know that our clients are making decisions that aren't good for them. But we have to remember that we have to protect their self-determination and their safety. So unless there is a credible threat of serious harm, we still need to let them make their own choices. And we also can't forget that culture is going to shape everything about how people experience harm, healing, trust, and safety. So in order to have ethical competence, you need to have cultural competence. And you need to understand that making assumptions can lead you to some pretty dire ethical misjudgments. Even if you have good intentions, you can definitely damage client relationships if you aren't having cultural humility and practicing cultural competence. So, as we think about ethics, we need to continually take a cultural lens and ask ourselves, what assumptions might I be bringing into this decision? What am I not seeing or not asking? Whose experiences might I be missing? How can I widen my perspective? And how do I check on whose voices are really being centered? Ethical practice requires examining those cultural filters. And even experienced practitioners can really have blind spots in this. I think a really good example they might have talked about in the book was if you have parents from another culture that were raised to believe that physical punishment and discipline of children was okay, and then they move here and you have to talk to them about the laws and things. So the way you would approach that would be with some perspective and with some empathy, while still sharing with them the important information about what's legal and illegal and what are some things that they can do instead. So ethical practice really demands us to challenge our own biases across a lifelong process. And one powerful example of maybe not only like cultural humility, but law and ethics colliding is when we look at immigration work. So sometimes legal compliance, like mandatory reporting or client eligibility rules, can actually cause harm or violate human dignity. And in this article by Furman and others, they remind us that when laws go against core human rights, social workers have an ethical obligation to resist and not just comply. So, for example, to be legally compliant, our licensure might require legal adherence, adhering to laws. Agency funding might depend on compliance with different immigration laws, and there might be legal consequences for not complying to certain immigration laws. And at the same time, we have to balance that with our ethical imperative. The NASW code demands respect for human dignity regardless of their immigration status. So you have to find a path between these legal structures and your ethical practice, and you can do that by seeking supervision, seeking that community support, advocating for policy change, and being sure to really document the steps you're taking in this decision making when you're facing a conflict like this. And at the end of the day, these kinds of dilemmas are going to take a lot of ethical courage on our part. And I think it's really important to remember that ethical courage isn't usually about these grand dramatic gestures, right? Like filibustering in front of Congress or being in the newspaper or getting arrested in a protest. Most ethical courage is built through small principle choices, like reporting unethical behavior when you see it, challenging unfair policies when you can, and speaking up even when you feel a bit uncomfortable. These small acts, they add up, and they build up your strength and your resilience to navigate even harder situations when you're in them. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, making ethical decisions can feel really, really lonely and uncertain. And that discomfort's normal and necessary for growth. At the end of the day, ethical dilemmas aren't something you're ever going to solve once and for all. So you need to build up your resilience. They are ongoing, and new contexts are going to bring new tensions. And so your reflection upon your ethical practice can never stop. So in order to do this, you really have to learn to embrace discomfort, build courage gradually through those small choices on a daily basis, and find a community you feel comfortable sharing those ethical burdens with, and find colleagues that you know can help you through these decisions. And while these small acts may often feel invisible, they're creating this essential light and change. So again, ethical dilemmas don't disappear as you gain experience. They evolve, and staying ethical means staying reflective. As we work through these ethical dilemmas, it's easy to fall into some common traps. So one pitfall is defaulting to agency policies without really reflecting on them. I've worked in many workplaces, whether it be schools or nonprofits, and I've often heard the phrase like, well, that's the way we've always done it. That's a very big ethical pitfall. And you shouldn't just agree with something because it's the way it's always been done. At one point, we had to decide that slavery wasn't going to be a thing we did anymore after it's something we had always been doing. Another is prioritizing efficiency over dignity, especially when your agency needs to be focused on numbers and outcomes. So if you want that data to get grants, sometimes we turn to processes and policies that might be more focused on the turnover of clients and not necessarily on what they really need. And finally, sometimes we silence our own discomfort because it feels easier than challenging the way things have always been. However, discomfort is a helpful tool. Just like we know for our feelings in our physical body, discomfort is a big sign or signal that there's something going on that isn't right. So my advice here is to watch for moments when the way it's always been is starting to feel easier than asking, is this right? And know that's probably your time to take some kind of action or talk to somebody about what's bothering you. Here's the good news. While this stuff is complicated, we're not left empty-handed. There are real tools we can lean on. So the NASW Code of Ethics gives us a strong foundation. And then we have supervision and peer consultation to help us see different angles and reduce personal bias. Keeping up good documentation is going to protect our clients, our organizations, and ourselves. And practicing cultural humility will remind us that there's no ethical framework that works without the real world context being thought about. Finally, it's worth remembering that building ethical strength is a lot like building physical strength. It happens slowly through consistent practice and often through discomfort. So another reflection question you're going to have the option of answering in your post is to think back to a time when you chose principle over comfort or convenience. And what was that uncomfortable decision you faced? What supported your ethical stance, and what barriers challenged your resolve to follow through? And another option for your discussion post question is thinking about one area where you want to build more ethical courage. So for me, it's standing up and making comments and conversations when we talk about the prices of our services and plan for the next year. I really want to have the courage to try to push our organization more towards applying for grants and funding than raising prices for our clients to pay out of pocket. So I want you to think about one area maybe you could build more ethical courage and how you can practice it in small ways. So for me, it's like just bringing it up in those conversations. It doesn't have to be a big meeting. It doesn't need to be a big argument. For me, I really just need to start voicing that concern. And it's because even one brave little conversation is going to help strengthen your ethical practice over time. Okay, it looks like we've made it to the end. Here are your possible reflection questions. So 1, when have you experienced tension between following an organizational rule and doing what felt ethically right? 2, how might your cultural background influence your ethical decision-making and social work practice? 3, describe a time when you chose principle over comfort. What supported your stance? What barriers challenged you? Or 4, what is one area where you want to build more ethical courage? How could you practice it in small ways this year? Please just choose one question that resonates with your experience to answer on Yellow Dig. I wish everybody luck as we near the end of our semester, and thank you so much for listening.